Have you ever looked in a mirror and seen someone else staring back? That's exactly what happened to me on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Denver. I walked into my favorite coffee shop like I had done hundreds of times before. Mountain View Coffee was my sanctuary, my quiet place before starting each day. The familiar smell of freshly ground beans filled my senses. Sarah, the barista, was already preparing my usual order. Everything felt perfectly normal. But then I saw her, sitting in the corner, reading a book, with someone who looked exactly like me. Not similar, not resembling, exactly like me. My coffee cup started shaking in my hands. The woman at the table looked up from her book, and our eyes met. Time stopped completely. Other people in the coffee shop began to notice. I heard someone whisper, "Are they twins?" But I had no answer. I was an only child, or so I thought. My legs moved without my permission. I walked toward her table, feeling like I was in a dream. She stood up slowly, her movements mirroring mine perfectly. We stood there, trembling, unable to speak. It was like looking into a living mirror. Every freckle, every expression line, even the way she held her shoulders. Finally, I found my voice. It came out as barely a whisper. "Ooh, who are you?" The question hung in the air between us like a prayer. She looked at me with confusion and wonder. "I was about to ask you the same thing," she said, and even her voice sounded like mine. We sat down at her table, both of us shaking. "When were you born?" I asked, though something deep inside already knew the answer would change everything. "March 15th, 1996, she said. My heart stopped. "That's impossible," I whispered. "That's my birthday. That's my exact birthday." We stared at each other in absolute silence. The impossible was becoming possible. The unthinkable was becoming real. We weren't just strangers who looked alike. "I'm adopted," I said, my voice breaking. "I've always known that, but they never told me I had a sister. They never told me I had a twin." She reached across the table and touched my hand. Her skin felt exactly like mine. "I grew up in foster care," she whispered. "I always felt like half of me was missing." Tears streamed down both our faces. After 28 years, we had found each other. But how? Why were we separated? And why didn't anyone tell us? "We need answers," I said, wiping my tears. "We need to find out what happened to us, why we were separated. Will you help me find the truth?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I've been searching for my family my whole life. I never imagined I'd find my twin sister in a coffee shop in Denver." We stood up and hugged for the first time. It felt like coming home, like finding a piece of my soul I never knew was missing. But this was just the beginning. What we would discover about our past would change everything we thought we knew about love, sacrifice, and family. It would test our faith in ways we never imagined. Before we continue this incredible journey, I want to know where you're watching from. Are you Team Madison or Team Olivia? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for the most amazing true stories that will touch your heart. We sat there in stunned silence, two strangers who shared the same face, the same birthday, the same impossible reality. The coffee shop buzzed around us, but we existed in our own bubble of disbelief. I kept staring at her, searching for differences, for proof that this was just a cruel coincidence. But every feature, every expression, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, it was like watching myself in a mirror. The woman across from me had the same small scar above her left eyebrow that I'd gotten falling off my bike at age 6. She had the same dimple that only showed when she was nervous, the same way of biting her lower lip when thinking deeply. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice still shaking with disbelief. "Where did you grow up? What's your name? I need to understand how this is possible." She nodded, equally desperate for answers that might make sense of this impossible moment. "My name is Olivia," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Olivia Chun. I was adopted by the Chun family when I was 7, but I lived with different foster families before that. 3 different homes in 7 years." The name felt foreign yet familiar, like a song I'd heard in a dream. "Olivia," I repeated, testing how it fell on my tongue. It felt right, like a word I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. "I'm Madison," I replied, my heart breaking for what she'd been through. "Madison Williams." I was adopted as a baby by Robert and Janet Williams. They've been incredible parents, always honest about the adoption. They said it was a closed adoption, and they didn't know much about my birth parents, just that I was born healthy and loved. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed the difference in our experiences. "You were so lucky," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "To have a real family from the beginning, to never wonder if you were wanted." I spent my childhood moving from home to home, always feeling like I was just temporary, like I didn't belong anywhere. We pulled out our phones with trembling hands and started comparing photos. Baby pictures, school photos, family moments. The resemblance was undeniable. But more than that, we discovered we had the same mannerisms, the same way of tilting our heads when thinking, the same habit of twirling our hair when nervous. "Look at this," Olivia said, showing me a photo from when she was 5. I gasped and nearly dropped my phone. I had an almost identical photo from the same age, same pose, same smile, same way of holding my hands. It was like looking at parallel lives that had somehow been split apart. "This is impossible," I breathed. "How can two people who never met have such identical mannerisms and expressions?" I've always felt incomplete. I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Like there was this empty space inside me that I couldn't explain to anyone. My parents took me to therapy when I was younger because I kept talking about having an imaginary sister. I would set 2 places at my little tea table, save half my cookies for someone who wasn't there. But she wasn't imaginary, was she? Olivia's eyes widened with recognition and tears. "I did the exact thing," she breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "Every foster family thought I was making up stories about having a twin sister somewhere. I would talk to empty air, share my food with no one. The counselors said it was a coping mechanism for feeling abandoned." "This is incredible," Olivia said, leaning forward excitedly, her earlier sadness replaced by amazement. "Do you bite your nails when you're nervous?" I looked down at my hands, embarrassed by the childhood habit I'd never been able to break. "Yes, always. It drives my mom crazy." She held up her hands, showing identical bite marks on her fingernails. "Do you hate the sound of chalk on a blackboard but love thunderstorms?" My jaw dropped open. "How could you possibly know that?" "I've never told anyone about the chalk thing. It makes my skin crawl. But thunderstorms." I paused, remembering countless nights I'd sat by my window during storms, feeling oddly comforted. "They make me feel less alone somehow." We decided to write down everything we could remember about our childhoods, our families, any clues that might help us understand what happened to us and why we were separated. As we wrote, I noticed with growing amazement that we held our pens the same way, tilted our heads at the same angle, even paused to think at the exact moments. My adoption papers mention March 15th, 1996, at Denver General Hospital, I said, looking up from my notebook. The birth time was 3:47 a.m. Olivia's pen froze mid-sentence. "What about yours?" She looked up with eyes bright with hope and disbelief. "Denver General, March 15th, 1996. But my birth time was listed as 3:52 a.m. We stared at each other in silence. "Madison," she whispered, "we were definitely born together. You're 5 minutes older than me. I need to ask you something that might sound crazy," Olivia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Have you ever felt like you were talking to someone who wasn't there? Like having conversations with an invisible person, especially when you were upset or scared?" My heart stopped beating for a moment. The question hit me like a physical blow. Every night as a child, I whispered, barely able to speak. My parents thought it was just an overactive imagination, but I always felt like I was talking to my other half, my missing piece. When I was scared during thunderstorms or had nightmares, I would whisper to someone I couldn't see. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she squeezed my hand. "I did the exact thing, Madison, and I called her Maddie." "You call me Maddie," I said through my tears, the realization hitting me like a tsunami of emotion. "And I always called my invisible sister Livy. How is that possible? How did we know each other's names before we even met?" We sat there crying, holding hands across the small coffee shop table, finally understanding that the connection we'd felt our entire lives wasn't imagination or wishful thinking. It was real. It was each other. We had found our missing half, the piece of our souls that had been torn away at birth. The emptiness I'd carried for 28 years suddenly made perfect sense. I hadn't been talking to myself or an imaginary friend. I'd been talking to Olivia, my twin sister, separated by miles but connected by something deeper than distance. "We need to meet again tomorrow," I said, pulling myself together and wiping away the tears that kept flowing. "We need to share everything we know, every detail about our adoptions, our families, our memories. If we're going to find out why we were separated and who made that decision, we'll need to work together." Olivia nodded eagerly, already saving my number in her phone with shaking fingers. "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice filled with determination and hope. "Same time, Mountain View Coffee. We're going to find our answers, Madison. We're going to discover where we came from and why someone thought it was okay to separate twin sisters. And we're never going to be apart again." The drive home felt like an out-of-body experience. My hands were still trembling as I pulled into the driveway of the house I'd called home for 28 years. Everything looked the same: the white picket fence, the rose garden my mom had planted when I was 10, the welcome mat that said "Home Sweet Home." But everything felt different. I had a sister, a twin sister. As I walked through the front door, I called out like I had thousands of times before. "Mom? Dad? I need to talk to you both. Something incredible happened today, something that's going to change everything we thought we knew about my adoption." My parents, Robert and Janet Williams, were sitting in their usual spots on the living room couch, watching the evening news. The moment they saw my face, they knew something monumental had happened. Dad muted the television, and Mom set down her knitting. "Madison, sweetheart, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mom said, her nursing instincts kicking in immediately. "Sit down. Tell us what's wrong." I couldn't sit. I was too wired, too full of energy and emotion. "I met someone today," I began, my voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. "Someone who looks exactly like me. Not similar, not resembling, exactly like me. Born on the same day, at the same hospital, just 5 minutes after me." Dad's face changed instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, and his eyes widened with a mixture of recognition and something that looked like relief. "Oh my God," he whispered, sinking back into the couch cushions. "We always wondered. The adoption agency mentioned there might be." He trailed off, running his hands through his graying hair. Mom looked confused and increasingly worried. "Robert, what are you talking about?" "Madison, what exactly are you saying happened today?" Her voice carried that tone she used when she was trying to remain calm, but was actually terrified. I could see the fear in her eyes, fear that I was about to leave them, that finding my biological family meant losing the only family I'd ever known. Dad stood up slowly, like his legs weren't quite steady, and walked to the old oak desk in the corner where he kept important papers. "Madison, there's something we should have told you years ago, but we didn't want to get your hopes up or cause you pain if we were wrong." He opened a bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder I'd never seen before. "When we adopted you, the caseworker mentioned something about special circumstances and another placement. We always suspected." His voice broke. "We always suspected you might have a sibling who was also placed for adoption. The agency was very vague about the details, but they hinted that there was another baby born around the same time who needed a family." Mom stood up abruptly, tears already streaming down her face. "Madison, honey, please tell me this doesn't change how you feel about us. Please tell me you're not going to." She couldn't finish the sentence. I immediately wrapped her in a hug, feeling terrible that my news was causing her such pain. "Mom, nothing could ever change how I feel about you and Dad. You're my parents. You raised me. You loved me. You made me who I am today. Finding Olivia, that's her name, Olivia, finding her doesn't take anything away from what we have. It just adds to it." I pulled back to look into her worried brown eyes. "I need you both to understand that this isn't about replacing you. This is about filling a hole I didn't even know existed until today." Dad spread the adoption papers on a coffee table, his lawyer's training taking over as he organized the documents methodically. "Look here," he said, pointing to a section I'd never noticed before. "It says twin placement, sibling also placed for adoption through separate agency. We tried to get more information back then, but it was all confidential. The caseworker said it was in both children's best interests to be placed separately. I stared at the words on the yellowing paper, words that had been there my entire life, holding the secret of my sister's existence. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" I asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "We wanted to," Mom said softly, "but we were told by the social workers that it might be harmful to mention it unless we knew for certain. We didn't want you to spend your life searching for someone who might not exist or might not want to be found." Meanwhile, across town in her small one-bedroom apartment, Olivia was having a very different evening. She sat on her second-hand couch, staring at my phone number in her contacts, hardly daring to believe that this morning had really happened. The apartment was sparse, just the basics she'd managed to accumulate over the years. No family photos on the walls, no heirloom furniture passed down through generations. Just a few belongings that she'd carried from place to place throughout her childhood. She picked up a worn teddy bear from the couch beside her, the only constant companion from her early years. "I found her buttons," she whispered to the stuffed animal. "I found my sister. I'm not alone anymore." Olivia's hands shook as she dialed the number for her last foster family, the Johnsons, who had taken care of her from age 15 until she aged out of the system at 18. Mrs. Johnson had been the closest thing to a real mother she'd ever known. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar warm voice answered. "Olivia? Honey, is everything okay? You sound upset." Olivia took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to ask you something important. Do you remember anything from my adoption files about siblings? Did anyone ever mention that I might have a twin sister?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Olivia's heart began to race. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Johnson said finally, her voice heavy with emotion. "I always wondered when you'd ask about that." "There were rumors," Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice gentle but sad. "Nothing official in your files, but some of the social workers talked. They said there might have been another baby placed at the same time, but all the records were sealed tight. Your caseworker once mentioned something about twin girls being separated for their own good, but she never confirmed it was you. I always hoped you might have family out there somewhere." Olivia was crying now, years of wondering and hoping finally finding validation. "I found her today, Mrs. Johnson. I found my twin sister. Her name is Madison, and she's been living in Denver her whole life, just a few miles away from me. We've been in the same city for 28 years and never knew." Mrs. Johnson was crying too now. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. That's the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. You're not alone anymore, sweetheart. You have family." Back at my childhood home, I was wrapped in the warmest group hug of my life. Dad had tears in his eyes as he held both Mom and me. "We love you so much, Madison," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And if Olivia is your sister, then she's family to us too. We want to meet her. We want to welcome her into our lives. This house has always had room for one more." Mom pulled back and cupped my face in her hands, the same way she had when I was a scared little girl. "Tomorrow, when you meet with her again, you bring her here for dinner. I want to cook for my new daughter. I want to show her the photo albums, hear her stories, make sure she knows she belongs here too." My heart swelled with love for these 2 incredible people who had raised me. They weren't just my parents, they were about to become Olivia's parents too, and somehow that felt perfectly right. The next morning, I arrived at Washington Park 15 minutes early, my heart pounding with anticipation and nervous energy. I'd barely slept, my mind racing with questions and the surreal reality that I had a twin sister. As I walked along the familiar path where I'd jogged countless mornings, everything looked different through the lens of this new discovery. Then I saw her, Olivia, walking toward me with the same nervous energy, the same quick stride I recognized from looking in mirrors my entire life. We were both wearing jeans and white t-shirts, and we stopped dead in our tracks when we realized we'd unconsciously dressed almost identically. "Great minds think alike," she called out, and I couldn't help but laugh. Even our voices carried the same hint of nervous excitement. We found a quiet bench under a massive oak tree, the same spot where I used to come as a teenager when I needed to think. As we settled beside each other, I marveled again at how identical we were, not just in appearance, but in our mannerisms. We both sat with our legs crossed in exactly the same way, both unconsciously tucked our hair behind our right ears at the same moment. "This is so strange," Olivia said, shaking her head in wonder. "I feel like I'm looking at myself, but also like I'm meeting the person I've been searching for my whole life without even knowing it." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There was something so familiar about being near her, like my soul recognized hers, even though my mind was still trying to process the impossibility of it all. "Can I ask you to do something that might sound weird?" I said, pulling out a notebook and pen. "Write something, anything, and let me see how you hold the pen." Olivia looked puzzled, but took the pen from my hand. The moment she started writing, my mouth fell open. She held the pen exactly like I did, with this unusual grip where the pen rests against the side of my middle finger instead of the top. My elementary school teachers had tried for years to correct it, calling it the wrong way to hold a pen. "Oh my God," she breathed, looking at her own hand in amazement. Every teacher I ever had tried to fix this. They said I was the only student they'd ever seen who held a pen this way. We stared at each other, then at our identical hand positions, realizing this wasn't something that could be taught or learned. It was something we were born with. As we walked through the park, more incredible similarities emerged. "I have to ask," I said, stopping near the children's playground. "Are you afraid of heights, but somehow love roller coasters?" Olivia's eyes widened. "That makes no sense, but yes. I can't even climb a ladder to change a light bulb, but I'll ride the biggest roller coaster at Six Flags over and over. My friends think I'm crazy." I pointed to the climbing structure where kids were playing. "I used to have panic attacks on that thing when I was little, but my parents took me to amusement parks, and I was fearless on every ride. They never understood it. We discovered we both had an irrational fear of butterflies, but found moths fascinating. We both preferred thunderstorms to sunny days, and we both had this weird habit of eating pizza with a fork when no one was watching." I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures from my childhood, birthday parties, family vacations, school events. With each photo, Olivia's face grew more emotional. "You had such a happy childhood," she said softly, and I could hear both joy and sadness in her voice. "Look at how your parents are looking at you in these pictures, like you're the most precious thing in the world." I felt a stab of guilt for having been so fortunate when she had struggled. "Tell me about your childhood," I said gently. "I want to know everything, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts." She took a shaky breath and began sharing stories of foster homes, of feeling like an outsider, of lying awake at night, wondering if her real family was out there somewhere thinking about her. As Olivia shared her painful memories, I found myself crying, not just for her pain, but for the injustice of it all. We should have been together, supporting each other through everything. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, pulling her into a hug. "I'm sorry you went through all of that alone. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." She held me tighter than I'd ever been held before. "But you were there," she said through her tears. "Every night when I talked to my invisible sister, every time I felt less alone during a thunderstorm, you were there. I can't explain how, but I felt you my whole life." We stayed like that for several minutes, two halves of the same soul, finally reunited, mourning the lost years, but celebrating that we'd found each other at all. "We need to find out what happened," I said, wiping away my tears and trying to focus on moving forward. "We need to understand why we were separated and who made that decision. There has to be records somewhere, people who know the truth about our birth parents and why twins were split up." Olivia nodded, her sad expression shifting to one of determination. "I've been thinking about that all night. I want to hire a private investigator, someone who specializes in adoption cases. I have some money saved up from working extra shifts at the store." I immediately shook my head. "I'm paying for this. You've already been through enough, and I've had advantages you never had. This is the least I can do." "Madison, you don't owe me anything," Olivia protested, but I interrupted her. "Yes, I do. I owe you 28 years of sisterhood. I owe you half of every birthday cake, half of every Christmas morning, half of every family vacation. I owe you a childhood where you weren't alone." My voice was getting stronger, more determined. I can't give you back those years, but I can make sure we find the answers we need to move forward. I can make sure that whoever separated us, and whatever their reasons were, we understand what happened so we can decide how to deal with it. Olivia's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and hope rather than sadness. As we prepared to leave the park, we were walking in perfect synchronization, same pace, same length stride, even swinging our arms at the same rhythm. Other park visitors did double takes as we passed, and I heard one jogger say to his companion, "Did you see those twins? They even walk exactly alike." It struck me how natural this felt, how right it seemed to have someone beside me who moved through the world the same way I did. "Tomorrow," I said as we reached the park in trance, "we're going to start our search for answers. We're going to find out where we came from and why someone thought it was okay to separate sisters." Olivia squeezed my hand. "Together," she said firmly. "Whatever we find out, we face it together." Before we got into our separate cars, we hugged again, longer this time, like we're trying to make up for all the hugs we'd missed over the years. "Olivia," I said, holding her at arm's length so I could look in her eyes, my eyes. "I want you to know something. Whatever we discover about our past, whatever reasons people had for keeping us apart, nothing is going to separate us again. We're family now, and family sticks together." She smiled through her tears, the first truly happy smile I'd seen from her. "Family," she repeated, like she was tasting the word for the first time. I liked the sound of that. As we drove away in opposite directions, I knew our lives had changed forever. We weren't just two people who looked alike anymore. We were sisters, and we were about to uncover the truth that had been hidden from us for nearly 3 decades. The office of Detective Marcus Harris was exactly what I'd expected from a private investigator who specialized in family reunification cases. The walls were lined with certificates, testimonials, and photos of families he'd helped bring together over his 15-year career. As Madison and I sat across from his mahogany desk, I felt a mixture of hope and nervousness that made my hands tremble slightly. Detective Harris looked between us with the professional calm of someone who'd seen remarkable cases before, but I caught a flicker of amazement in his eyes as he took in our identical appearance. "In 30 years of investigating family cases," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "I can honestly say I've never had twins walk into my office who found each other by pure chance. This is going to be a fascinating case to work on." Detective Harris opened several thick file folders and spread various documents across his desk, sample adoption records, legal forms, and what looked like complicated family tree charts. "I need to be completely honest with you both about what this process involves," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Searching for biological parents from closed adoptions in the 1990s is complex work. Many records weren't digitized back then. Agencies sometimes closed or merged, and some information was deliberately sealed to protect privacy. This isn't like the DNA testing you see on TV. This is old-fashioned detective work that requires patience, persistence, and sometimes a little luck." I felt Madison reach over and squeeze my hand as the weight of his words settled over us. We were embarking on a journey that might lead nowhere, but we had to try. "The good news," Detective Harris continued, "is that you both have some documentation to work with. Madison, your adoption papers mentioned the hospital and approximate time of birth. Olivia, even though you went through the foster system, there should be original intake records somewhere that reference your birth circumstances." He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes as he spoke. "I'll start by contacting Denver General Hospital to see what birth records exist from March 15th, 1996. Then I'll reach out to the adoption agencies that were active in Denver during that time period. Colorado maintains a confidential intermediary program, which means there are legal channels for reuniting families if all parties consent." The professional way he laid out the process made it feel more real and achievable than the overwhelming task it had seemed in my mind. Detective Harris's expression softened as he looked at us both. "I also need to prepare you for the emotional aspects of this journey. In my experience, family reunification cases can have a wide range of outcomes. Some birth parents are overjoyed to be contacted and have been hoping for years that their children would find them. Others may be reluctant to revisit that chapter of their lives, especially if the circumstances surrounding the adoption were traumatic or difficult. I felt my stomach clench at his words. Madison and I had been so focused on finding answers that we hadn't really considered the possibility that our birth parents might not want to be found. What if they don't want to see us? I asked, voicing the fear that was suddenly overwhelming me. What if we're just painful reminders of something they'd rather forget? That's a valid concern, Detective Harris said gently, and it's one of the reasons I always counsel my clients to be prepared for any outcome. But I want you to consider something. The fact that you were separated as twins suggests there were unusual circumstances involved. Most agencies in the 1990s tried to keep sibling groups together unless there were compelling reasons not to. The separation itself might indicate that your birth parents faced an impossible situation and made the best decision they could under difficult circumstances. Madison spoke up for the first time since we'd sat down. You mean they might have wanted to keep us, but couldn't? Detective Harris nodded. It's one possibility. Financial hardship, family pressure, health issues, age of the birth mother. There are many factors that could have led to that decision. The important thing is that we approach this search with open hearts and realistic expectations. Detective Harris slid a contract across the desk to us, along with a detailed breakdown of his fees and timeline. My standard family reunification case takes between 3 to 6 months, depending on how much information we start with and how cooperative various agencies are. My fee is $5,000, which includes all research, record requests, phone calls, and travel within Colorado if necessary. If we need to expand the search to other states, or if legal proceedings become necessary, we'll discuss additional costs at that time. Madison immediately reached for her checkbook, but I put my hand on her arm. We're splitting this, I said firmly. I know you want to pay for everything, but this is our search, not just yours. I have $2,500 saved up, and I want to contribute equally to finding our family. The look of gratitude in her eyes told me I'd made the right decision. After we signed the contract and wrote our checks, Detective Harris began organizing our case materials into neat, labeled folders. I'll start by submitting record requests to Denver General Hospital and the 3 largest adoption agencies that were operating in 1996. I'll also check with the Colorado Department of Human Services to see what information is available through official channels. He handed us each a business card and a client information packet. I typically provide updates to my clients every 2 weeks, either by phone or email, depending on your preference. I believe in keeping families informed throughout the process, even when progress seems slow. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key that unlocks everything else. The systematic way he approached our case gave me confidence that we'd chosen the right person to help us. As we prepared to leave, Detective Harris stood and shook hands with both of us. First Madison, then me. I want you both to know that I consider this case a privilege to work on. Finding family members who've been separated is the most rewarding part of my job, and the fact that you found each other first makes this story even more special. He walked us to the door of his office, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe. I've reunited hundreds of families over the years, and I've learned that when people are meant to find each other, the universe has a way of making it happen. You two finding each other in that coffee shop wasn't just coincidence. It was the first step in a larger journey. His words sent chills down my spine because deep in my heart, I believed he was right. As we walked down the hallway toward the elevator, Madison and I were both quiet, processing everything Detective Harris had told us. The next 3 to 6 months were going to be an emotional roller coaster of waiting, hoping, and preparing ourselves for whatever we might discover. Are you scared? I asked Madison as we waited for the elevator to arrive. She considered the question seriously before answering. Terrified, she admitted, but also more hopeful than I've ever been in my life. For the first time, I feel like I'm going to get answers to questions I didn't even know I was allowed to ask. The elevator doors opened, and as we stepped inside, I realized that no matter what Detective Harris discovered about our past, Madison and I had already found the most important thing. We'd found each other. As the elevator descended, Madison turned to me with an expression of determination I was beginning to recognize as identical to my own when I'd made up my mind about something. "Olivia, I want you to promise me something," she said, her voice steady and serious. "No matter what we find out about our birth parents, no matter what the circumstances were that led to our separation, we stick together. We're family now, and nothing, not painful truths, not reluctant relatives, not complicated emotions, nothing is going to come between us again." I looked into her eyes, my eyes, and felt a sense of completeness I'd never experienced before. "I promise," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "We're in this together, Madison. For better or worse, we're going to face whatever comes next as sisters." The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and we stepped out into our new reality. Two women who were no longer searching alone. 2 weeks after hiring Detective Harris, I was at work teaching my afternoon art class when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. My heart immediately jumped. We'd been waiting anxiously for any news from our investigation. I stepped into the hallway and answered on the second ring. "Madison Williams." "Madison, it's Detective Harris. I have news, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this." The excitement in his voice was unmistakable, and my hands started shaking immediately. "Did you find something? Did you find our birth parents?" "I found your birth mother," he said, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling down. "Her name is Linda Martinez, and Madison, she's still living right here in Colorado." "She's alive," I whispered, tears already starting to form in my eyes. The possibility that our birth mother might have passed away had been one of my biggest fears throughout this process. "Very much alive," Detective Harris confirmed. "And there's more. The records I found paint a picture that I think will help you understand what happened 28 years ago. Your mother was very young when she had you girls, only 24, and she was in an extremely difficult financial situation. She was working 2 minimum wage jobs just to afford a tiny apartment, and when she found out, she was carrying twins." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling on his end. "The records show that she initially tried to keep both of you, but the circumstances became overwhelming very quickly. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia was working her shift at the department store where her phone started ringing persistently. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Detective Harris's number. Her heart immediately started racing, and she looked around frantically for her supervisor. "Mrs. Peterson, I need to take this call. It's about my family situation I told you about." Her supervisor nodded understandingly, and Olivia hurried to the break room, her hands trembling as she answered the phone. "Detective Harris? Please tell me you have good news." "Olivia, I found her. I found your birth mother, and she's living in Pueblo, Colorado. Her name is Linda Martinez." Olivia sank into one of the plastic break room chairs, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through her. After 28 years of wondering, she finally had a name and a location. Detective Harris continued explaining his findings to both sisters during separate phone calls, painting a picture that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The records from Denver General Hospital show that Linda gave birth to identical twin girls on March 15, 1996, at 3:47 and 3:52 a.m. She named you Madison Rose and Olivia Grace Martinez. For the first few months, she tried desperately to care for both of you, but she was living in poverty and had no family support system. He flipped through several pages of documentation, his voice becoming more emotional as he continued. The social services reports from that time indicate that Linda was barely able to afford formula and diapers for 2 babies. She was working at a diner during the day and cleaning offices at night, trying to make ends meet. "The most important thing you both need to understand," Detective Harris said, his voice taking on a gentler tone, "is that the decision to place one of you for adoption wasn't made lightly or quickly." According to the caseworker's notes, Linda spent weeks agonizing over the decision. She consulted with social workers, spoke with other single mothers, and even reached out to local churches for help. But ultimately, she realized that she couldn't provide adequately for 2 babies, and she made the painful choice to ensure that at least one of her daughters would have the advantages and opportunities she couldn't provide. He paused, letting the weight of this information settle. The notes indicate that choosing which twin to place for adoption was the most difficult decision of her life. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot, crying so hard I could barely speak. How did she choose? I asked Detective Harris, my voice breaking. How does a mother choose which of her children to give away? The silence on his end told me this was the part of the story he'd been dreading to share. According to the caseworker's notes, Linda chose you for adoption, Madison, because you were born first and seemed slightly stronger as a newborn. She hoped that would give you better chances with an adoptive family. She kept Olivia initially, thinking she could manage with one baby. The guilt that hit me was overwhelming. I'd had the privileged childhood, the loving parents, the opportunities, all because I was born 5 minutes earlier and seemed healthier as a newborn. The randomness and unfairness of it made me feel sick. Olivia was having her own emotional breakdown in the store break room as Detective Harris explained the same information to her. So she did want to keep us both, she said through her tears, finally getting an answer to the question that had haunted her entire life. She didn't just abandon us. She was forced to make an impossible choice. Detective Harris's voice was full of compassion as he responded. That's exactly right, Olivia. And there's something else you need to know. After you were placed in foster care at age 3, Linda spent years trying to get you back. She worked multiple jobs, saved money, took parenting classes, did everything the social workers asked her to do. But by the time she was financially stable enough to petition for your return, you had already been placed for adoption with the Chun family. Here's what I found about Linda's current situation, Detective Harris continued, his voice becoming more hopeful. She's 52 years old now and works as a custodian at Parkview Medical Center in Pueblo. She's never married, never had other children. The hospital staff I spoke with describe her as hardworking, kind, and devoted to her job. She lives in a small apartment on the south side of town. Nothing fancy, but clean and well-maintained according to the neighbors I interviewed. He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers again. Most importantly, when I spoke discreetly with some of her coworkers, they mentioned that Linda has photos on her locker of 2 baby girls. After all these years, she's never stopped thinking about you both. Both Madison and Olivia were processing this information at the same time, each in their separate locations, each dealing with the overwhelming emotions of finally understanding their origin story. Detective Harris, Madison said from her car, Does she want to see us? Have you contacted her yet? That's the next step, he replied. I wanted to get your permission before reaching out to her directly. Some clients prefer to process the information first before I make contact with birth parents. It's entirely up to you how you want to proceed. Olivia, still in the break room, asked the same question almost word for word. The twins were even thinking in sync, despite being miles apart. We want to meet her, they both said simultaneously into their phones. We want to see our mother. Detective Harris made careful notes in both of their files as he concluded the calls. I'll contact Linda Martinez within the next few days. I'll explain that I represent 2 young women who are searching for their birth family, and I'll gauge her reaction before revealing that you're her daughters. If she's receptive to contact, I'll arrange a meeting in a neutral, comfortable location. If she's hesitant, I'll work with her at her own pace to help her process this development. He closed the folders with a sense of satisfaction. Ladies, I have to say, in all my years of doing this work, I've rarely seen a case where the pieces fit together so clearly. Linda Martinez has been waiting for this day for 28 years, just like you've been waiting to find her. I have a very good feeling about how this reunion is going to go. The 2-hour drive from Denver to Pueblo felt like the longest journey of my life. Madison and I had barely spoken since leaving the city, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what we were about to face. The Colorado landscape rolled past our windows, golden fields, distant mountains, small towns that looked like they'd been frozen in time. Every mile brought us closer to answers we'd been seeking our entire lives, but also closer to a confrontation with truths that might be difficult to accept. What if she doesn't want to see us? I finally asked, breaking the tense silence that had filled the car for the past hour. Madison glanced at me from the passenger seat, and I could see the same fear reflected in her eyes that was churning in my stomach. Pueblo was smaller and more humble than I had expected. The apartment complex where Linda Martinez lived was a collection of simple two-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard, the kind of place where working-class families lived quiet, unpretentious lives. The address Detective Harris had given us led to Building C, Apartment 2B. We sat in the parked car for several minutes, staring up at the second-floor window that might belong to our birth mother. The building was clean but obviously old, with slightly faded paint and small patches of grass that someone had tried hard to keep green despite the Colorado heat. "This is it," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible. "Our mother lives right there, probably getting ready for work or watching television, having no idea that her daughters are sitting outside." We finally worked up the courage to get out of the car, our legs shaky with nerves and anticipation. The walk from the parking area to the building entrance felt surreal, like we were moving through a dream. Other residents were going about their Saturday afternoon routines, children playing in the courtyard, someone grilling on a small balcony, the normal sounds of family life that we'd never experienced together. As we climbed the stairs to the second floor, our footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell, and I found myself gripping Madison's hand tightly. We were about to meet the woman who had carried us for 9 months, given birth to us, and made the most difficult decision of her life when she was forced to choose between us. We stood outside apartment 2B for what felt like an eternity, staring at the simple brass numbers on the door. Behind that door was our mother, the woman whose DNA we carried, whose eyes we'd inherited, whose heartbreak had shaped the first 28 years of our lives. I raised my hand to knock, then lowered it again, suddenly terrified of what would happen next. What if she looked at us and felt only pain? What if seeing us brought back memories she'd spent decades trying to forget? Madison seemed to sense my hesitation and gently took my raised hand in both of hers. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we face it together. We're not that scared little girl who grew up wondering about her family anymore. We're strong women who deserve to know where we came from." I finally found the courage to knock, 3 soft taps that seemed to echo through the hallway like thunder. We heard footsteps approaching from inside, the sound of a chain being unlatched, and then the door opened slowly. The woman who appeared in the doorway was unmistakably our mother. She had the same green eyes we both shared, the same bone structure, even the same way of standing with one hip slightly cocked. Her auburn hair was now streaked with gray, and her face showed the lines of someone who had worked hard her entire life. But there was no mistaking the family resemblance. Linda Martinez looked from me to Madison and back again, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally overwhelming shock. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she began to tremble visibly. "No," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible through her fingers. "This can't be real. This can't be happening." Her eyes darted back and forth between us, and I watched as 28 years of grief, guilt, and hope crashed over her all at once. She was still wearing her work uniform from the hospital, simple scrubs that had seen better days, and her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. "Are you?" she started to ask, but couldn't finish the question. The words seemed to stick in her throat, as if saying them aloud might make this moment disappear like a cruel dream. Madison stepped forward slightly, her own voice trembling with emotion. "We're your daughters," she said softly. "I'm Madison, and this is Olivia. We've been looking for you." The moment Madison said those words, Linda's knees buckled, and both Madison and I instinctively stepped forward to catch her. She was sobbing now, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place of pain she'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades. "My babies," she kept repeating through her tears. "My beautiful babies. I've thought about you every single day. Every single day for 28 years. We helped her into her small apartment, supporting her weight between us as she struggled to process what was happening. The apartment was modest but spotlessly clean, and I immediately noticed that the refrigerator was covered with photos, including several baby pictures that I now realized must be of Madison and me from our first few months of life. What happened next was the most emotional moment of my entire life. Linda pulled both Madison and me into her arms, holding us with a desperate intensity, as if she was afraid we might disappear if she let go. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed into our hair. I'm so sorry I had to choose. I'm so sorry I couldn't keep you both. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and not a day has passed that I haven't regretted it. Haven't wondered if I made the right choice. Haven't prayed that you would find me someday and forgive me. The three of us stood there in the middle of her tiny living room, crying and holding each other, finally reunited after 28 years of separation. In that moment, I understood that Linda hadn't given us away because she didn't want us. She had sacrificed her own happiness to give us chances at better lives. As we settled onto her worn but comfortable couch, Linda couldn't stop touching us, smoothing our hair, holding our hands, studying our faces as if she was trying to memorize every detail. You're so beautiful, she kept saying. You're both so beautiful and grown up. Tell me everything. Tell me about your lives, your families, your dreams. I want to know everything I've missed. The desperation in her voice to know us, to understand who we'd become, was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. Madison began telling Linda about her childhood with Robert and Janet, her career as an art teacher, her happy but somehow incomplete life. I shared my more difficult story of foster homes and feeling perpetually displaced, but also my determination to make something of myself despite the challenges. As the afternoon progressed, Linda showed us photo albums, baby clothes she'd kept, and even hospital bracelets from the day we were born. I never threw anything away, she explained, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't bear to get rid of any reminder of the 3 months I had with both of you, or the 3 years I had with Olivia. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day, I would look at these pictures and wonder what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you ever thought about me. She pulled out a shoebox filled with letters, dozens and dozens of letters addressed to my dear Madison and my sweet Olivia that she'd written over the years but never sent. 28 years of a mother's love, preserved in handwritten pages, waiting for the day when she could finally share her heart with the daughters she'd never stopped loving. Linda's hands shook as she held both of ours, her weathered fingers tracing the lines of our palms like she was trying to memorize every detail. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through her small apartment windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made this surreal reunion feel almost sacred. I need to tell you the whole story, she said, her voice thick with 28 years of suppressed emotion. You deserve to know everything. The truth about why I had to make the choice I made, the truth about how much it broke my heart, and the truth about how every day since then has been filled with regret and love and hope that someday I would see you again. Her green eyes, our green eyes, were red-rimmed from crying, but there was a determination in them now, a need to finally unburden herself of the secret she'd carried alone for so long. I was 24 when I got pregnant with you girls, Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father. She paused, pain flickering across her features. His name was Michael Chun. He was charming, handsome, and he promised me the world. We weren't married, but he said we would be as soon as he got his life together. When I told him I was carrying twins, he looked at me like I had just destroyed his entire future. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. He left that very night, packed his things while I was sleeping, and disappeared. I never saw him again, never heard from him again. I was alone, pregnant with twins, working as a waitress at a diner that paid barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment. Madison squeezed my hand as we absorbed this information about the man who had contributed half our DNA, but nothing else to our lives. Linda reached into a small wooden box beside the couch and pulled out a faded photograph. A young woman with bright auburn hair and hopeful eyes, her hand resting on a very pregnant belly. This was me at 7 months, she said, passing us the photo. I was so excited to meet you both, so determined to be the best mother in the world despite the circumstances. I had painted a tiny nursery corner in my studio apartment with bright yellow paint since I didn't know you were both girls, and I had bought 2 cribs from a thrift store that I spent weeks refinishing by hand. The photo showed a different person than the tired, worn woman sitting beside us now. This Linda looked young and optimistic, full of dreams about the family she was about to create. I had your names picked out before you were even born. Madison Rose and Olivia Grace. I wanted you to have beautiful names that would remind you every day that you were loved. When you were born, Linda continued, her voice taking on a dreamlike quality as she relived that night. It was March 15th, 1996. I had been in labor for 14 hours, and I was exhausted and scared, but the moment they placed you both on my chest, I felt a love so intense it physically hurt. Madison, you came first at 3:47 a.m., crying loudly and already showing that stubborn personality. Olivia, you followed 5 minutes later, quieter, but just as perfect. The nurse said she'd rarely seen newborn twins who looked so identical. And I remember thinking that you were going to have each other for your whole lives, that you'd never be alone the way I had been. The irony of that statement, that we'd actually been separated for most of our lives, hung heavy in the air between us. For 3 months, Linda said, her voice breaking completely now, I tried to make it work. I was so sleep-deprived, I could barely function, working double shifts at the diner when I could find childcare, living on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. You girls were perfect babies, but twins are expensive, double the diapers, double the formula, double the doctor visits. I was spending more on babysitters than I was earning, falling behind on rent, sometimes going days without eating so I could afford to feed you. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of those memories clearly still painful after all these years. I applied for government assistance, reached out to local churches, begged my boss for more hours, but nothing was enough. I was drowning, and I was terrified that my inability to provide for you would hurt you both. The social worker who came to check on us was named Mrs. Patterson. Linda continued, her voice steadying as she forced herself to continue the story. She was kind but honest. She told me that if I couldn't improve my situation within 30 days, both of you would be placed in foster care temporarily while I got back on my feet. But she also mentioned that there were families, good families, who were desperate to adopt newborn twins. Families who could provide everything I couldn't. Stable homes, college funds, opportunities one could never give you. Linda looked directly at us, her eyes pleading for understanding. She said the most loving thing a parent could do was sometimes to let their children go to people who could give them better lives. But she also said that if I couldn't care for 2 babies, maybe I could manage with 1. Choosing which one of you to give away was the most impossible decision any mother should ever have to make, Linda said, her voice barely audible now. How do you choose between 2 perfect, identical daughters? How do you decide which child deserves the better life, and which one you'll try to raise in poverty? I spent weeks agonizing over it, holding you both and crying, knowing that whatever I decided would haunt me forever. She looked at Madison with eyes full of ancient pain. I chose you for adoption, Madison, because you were born 5 minutes earlier and the doctors said you had slightly better reflexes as a newborn. It seemed like such a small difference, but I convinced myself it meant you would be stronger, more resilient, better able to handle being separated from me. The arbitrary nature of that decision, 5 minutes and slightly better reflexes determining our entire life paths, was almost too painful to comprehend. Linda reached into her wooden box again and pulled out a manila folder filled with official-looking documents. These are the adoption papers I signed when you were 4 months old, Madison. The Williams family seemed like a gift from God, educated, financially stable, desperate for a child to love. Robert was already a successful lawyer. Janet was a nurse who had struggled with infertility for years. They promised to love you like their own daughter, to give you every opportunity, to never let you doubt that you were wanted and cherished. She handed the papers to Madison with shaking hands. I made them promise to tell you that you were adopted, that you came from love even though I couldn't keep you. I hoped someday you might understand that giving you away was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I did it because I loved you too much to let you suffer in poverty with me. And Olivia, Linda said, turning to me with fresh tears streaming down her face, I tried so hard to keep you. For 3 years, I worked myself to exhaustion trying to provide for you. But I was young and inexperienced, and eventually the stress and financial pressure broke me down. When you were 3, I had a complete nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for 2 weeks. While I was gone, you were placed in emergency foster care, and by the time I was released and had gotten my life somewhat together, the state decided you would be better off in permanent placement. Her voice was raw with grief and self-recrimination. I fought in court, took parenting classes, got a better job, did everything they asked, but they said I had already proven I couldn't provide stable care. They terminated my parental rights when you were 4, and you were adopted by the Chun family shortly after. The full tragedy of our family story was now clear. Not malice or abandonment, but poverty, youth, and a system that sometimes separated families in the name of child welfare. The silence that followed Linda's confession was filled with 28 years of pain, regret, and love that had never found its proper expression. Finally, Madison spoke, her voice steady despite her tears. "Mom, you were just a kid yourself. 24 years old, alone, with no support system, and 2 babies to care for. You made the best decisions you could with impossible choices. I found my voice as well. You didn't abandon us. You sacrificed your own happiness to try to give us better lives. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be honored." The 3 of us held each other tightly, and for the first time since we'd walked through her door, I felt Linda's body begin to relax, as if a weight she'd carried for nearly 3 decades was finally beginning to lift. "I love you both so much," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping, never stopped being your mother, even when I couldn't be with you." After we had cried together and Linda had shared the painful truth of our separation, she stood up slowly and walked to an old wooden trunk in the corner of her living room. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she was about to reveal something sacred that she'd been protecting for years. "There's something I need to show you both," she said, her voice still hoarse from crying but steadier now. "Something I've been saving for 28 years, hoping that someday I would have the chance to share it with my daughters." She knelt beside the trunk and lifted the heavy lid, and even from across the room, I could see that it was filled with carefully preserved items, photographs, clothing, papers, and mementos that spoke of a mother's love that had never died. The first things Linda pulled from the trunk were 2 sets of tiny baby clothes, 1 pink outfit and 1 yellow outfit, both carefully wrapped in tissue paper and preserved as if they were precious artifacts. "These are the outfits I brought you home from the hospital in," she said, holding them up with trembling hands. "I couldn't bear to throw them away or give them to charity. Every year on your birthday, I would take them out and hold them, remembering how small and perfect you were." The clothes were impossibly tiny, faded with age, but still showing traces of the bright colors they had once been. Madison reached out to touch the pink outfit, and I could see her imagining herself as the baby who had once worn it, trying to connect with a piece of her history she'd never known existed. Next came our hospital identification bracelets, 2 tiny plastic bands that read Baby Girl Martinez and Baby Girl Martinez B, along with our original birth certificates that showed our full names, Madison Rose Martinez and Olivia Grace Martinez. "I kept everything from the hospital," Linda explained. "Your footprints, the cards and nurses gave me, even the little hats they put on your heads in the nursery. I know it might seem obsessive, but these were the only proof I had that you had existed, that for 4 months you had been mine." She handed us our birth certificates, and seeing our names written in official script, names our birth mother had chosen with such care, felt like reclaiming a piece of our identity that had been missing our entire lives. The photo albums Linda pulled from the trunk were like discovering a lost chapter of our lives. Page after page of pictures showed us as babies, sleeping, eating, playing, being held by our young mother who looked exhausted but radiantly happy. "I took pictures constantly during those first 4 months," Linda said, turning the pages slowly so we could absorb every image. "I somehow knew, even then, that our time together was going to be limited, and I wanted to capture every moment, every expression, every milestone. There were photos of us lying together in a single crib, our tiny hands touching even in sleep. Photos of Linda feeding us bottles simultaneously, looking overwhelmed but determined. Photos of us at 3 months old, already showing the identical features that would make strangers do double takes 28 years later. Perhaps most touching of all was a handmade baby book that Linda had created, documenting every detail of our first 4 months of life. She had recorded our weights at birth, our feeding schedules, the dates we first smiled, the songs she sang to us during late-night feedings. Madison smiled first, she told us, pointing to an entry dated April 2nd, 1996. You were exactly 18 days old, and you looked right at me and gave me this beautiful, gummy smile that made all the sleepless nights worth it. Olivia, you smiled 3 days later, but yours was different, more thoughtful, like you had been considering whether I deserved it or not. The specificity of her memories, the care with which she had documented our earliest days, spoke to a love so deep that it had survived nearly 3 decades of separation. The most heartbreaking discovery in the trunk was a shoebox filled with letters, hundreds of them, written on various types of paper over the years, all addressed to my dear Madison, or my sweet Olivia. I wrote to you constantly, Linda explained, her voice thick with emotion. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day, every time something significant happened in my life or when I saw something that reminded me of you, I would sit at my kitchen table and write you letters, telling you about my day, sharing my hopes for your lives, asking forgiveness for the choices I had to make. She pulled out a few examples, and we could see dates spanning from 1996 to just a few months ago. Letters from a heartbroken young mother, evolving into correspondence from a woman who had spent her entire adult life wondering about the children she'd been forced to give up. Linda opened one of the more recent letters, dated just 6 months earlier, and began to read aloud. My dear daughters, today would have been your 28th birthday, and as I do every year, I'm wondering what you're doing, whether you're happy, whether you ever think about the mother who loved you enough to let you go. I saw twin girls at the grocery store today who looked about your age, and my heart stopped for a moment, wondering if it could be you. I know the chances are impossible, but I can't stop hoping that someday, somehow, we'll find each other again. Her voice broke as she read, and both Madison and I were crying again, overwhelmed by the realization that while we had been living our separate lives, our mother had been thinking about us every single day, writing letters we would never receive, loving us from a distance that must have felt unbearable. The trunk also contained evidence of Linda's efforts to build a better life, perhaps in hopes that someday she might be worthy of reconnecting with us. Employment records showing her progression from waitress to hospital custodian, pay stubs from the multiple jobs she'd worked, certificates from night school classes she'd taken to improve her skills. I never stopped trying to become someone you could be proud of, she said, spreading the documents across the coffee table. I know I failed you both by not being able to provide what you needed when you were babies, but I wanted you to know that I never gave up trying to be better, trying to become the mother you deserved. The evidence of her lifelong efforts to improve herself, combined with the modest apartment where she still lived, painted a picture of someone who had worked tirelessly but had never quite escaped the economic circumstances that had originally separated our family. The last items Linda pulled from the trunk were 2 small gold lockets, tarnished with age but carefully preserved. These were my mother's, your grandmother's, she said, opening them to reveal tiny photographs of Madison and me as newborns. I had planned to give them to you when you turned 16, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Instead, she fastened one locket around Madison's neck and the other around mine, her hands gentle and sure despite their trembling. She died when I was 19, just a few years before you were born. I think she would have been so proud of the beautiful, strong women you've become. She always told me that love finds a way, that families are connected by invisible threads that can stretch but never break. As the weight of the lockets settled against our chests, I felt connected not just to Linda, but to a grandmother I'd never known, to a family history that was finally being restored to us piece by precious piece. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Linda's small apartment, the 3 of us sat surrounded by the artifacts of our shared history. Photos, letters, baby clothes, and memories that had been carefully preserved through 28 years of separation. The trunk that had held our past was now empty, but our hearts were full in a way they had never been before. I know I can't give you back the childhood you should have had together, Linda said, her voice steady now, her tears finally spent. I can't undo the pain my choices caused or erase the years we lost. But I can give you this truth. You were conceived in love, born in love, and every day since then you have been carried in my heart with more love than I knew was possible. Madison reached over and took my hand, and together we pulled Linda into another embrace. Not the desperate, grief-stricken hug of our first meeting, but a peaceful, healing embrace of a family that had finally found its way back together. 6 months after that life-changing reunion in Pueblo, our family had grown in ways I never could have imagined. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the Williams family dining room had been transformed to accommodate not just the usual 3 family members, but our newly expanded family of 4. Robert and Janet had insisted that Linda move closer to Denver so we could all spend more time together, and they had helped her find a small but comfortable apartment just 15 minutes away from the house where I'd grown up. The dining room table, which had always seemed too big for just 3 people, now felt perfectly sized as Janet carefully arranged 4 place settings with her best china, humming softly as she worked. The smell of turkey and all the traditional fixings filled the house, but this year felt different than any Thanksgiving before. This year, we were truly complete. In the kitchen, something beautiful was happening that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Janet and Linda were working side by side, preparing the Thanksgiving feast together like old friends rather than 2 women who had been connected by circumstance and adoption. Janet was showing Linda her secret recipe for stuffing, while Linda shared stories about the traditional Mexican dishes her own mother used to make for holidays when she was a child. You know, Janet said as she basted the turkey, I used to be so worried about this day coming, the day when Madison would find her birth family and I would have to share her. But now I realize how silly that fear was. Love doesn't get divided when it's shared, it multiplies. Linda wiped away a tear as she mashed potatoes, overwhelmed by the acceptance and warmth she'd been shown by the people who had raised her daughter. Madison and I were in the living room, curled up together on the couch where we'd spent countless hours over the past 6 months, sharing stories and memories as we tried to fill in 28 years of separation. We had developed our own tradition of spending Sunday afternoons together, sometimes just talking, sometimes working on art projects. Madison had been teaching me to paint, discovering that I had inherited some of her artistic talent. Do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if we'd grown up together? I asked, flipping through one of Janet's photo albums that documented Madison's childhood. All the time, she admitted. But then I think about how we might have taken each other for granted if we'd always been together. Maybe we appreciate each other more because we know what it feels like to be without our other half. As we all gathered around the dining table, Robert stood to say grace, a tradition he'd maintained throughout Madison's childhood. But this year, his words carried extra weight and meaning. Dear God, we thank you for this food, for this home, and most especially for the miracle of family that has expanded our hearts this year. We're grateful for Linda, who made the ultimate sacrifice of love 28 years ago, and for Olivia, who has brought such joy into our lives. We thank you for showing us that families can be made not just by blood or adoption, but by choice, by love, and by the willingness to open our hearts to each other. His voice broke slightly as he continued. And we thank you for proving that love really does find a way, that separated hearts can be reunited, and that it's never too late for new beginnings. The dinner conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter, shared memories, and plans for the future. Linda, who had spent so many holidays alone over the years, seemed almost overwhelmed by the warmth and inclusion she was experiencing. She had started working as a teacher's aide at a local elementary school, a job that Madison had helped her find, and she was thriving in an environment where she could nurture and care for children again. I love my new job, she told Robert and Janet. Working with kids reminds me every day why I made the choices I made 28 years ago. These children deserve every opportunity, every advantage, every bit of love we can give them. Janet reached over and squeezed Linda's hand. You're going to be wonderful at it. You have such a nurturing heart, and now you get to share that with children who need it. After dinner, as we all settled in the living room with coffee and leftover pie, Robert surprised Linda with something none of us had been expecting. "Linda, there's something Janet and I have been discussing, and we wanted to run it by you and the girls," he said, pulling out some official-looking document from his briefcase. "We know that legally, we're Madison's parents through adoption, and the Chun family were Olivia's legal parents. But we were wondering how you would feel about us helping you petition the court to have your parental rights restored, not to take the girls away from the families who raised them, but to officially recognize you as their mother again." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she looked back and forth between Madison and me. "I don't need legal documents to know that you're my daughters," she said softly. "But if it would make our family official in the eyes of the law." Madison and I looked at each other, that silent communication that had developed between us over the past 6 months, allowing us to have an entire conversation without words. Then we both stood up and went to Linda, wrapping her in the kind of group hug that had become our family's signature gesture. "We don't need papers to tell us we're family," I said, echoing her sentiment. "But if having official recognition would make you happy, then we want that for you." Madison nodded in agreement. "You never stopped being our mother, Linda. You just became our mother in a different way. The mother who loved us enough to let us go, so we could have better lives, and the mother who never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other. The legal restoration would be symbolic more than anything else, but symbols matter when it comes to healing old wounds and creating new traditions." Later that evening, as Janet and Linda worked together to clean up the dinner dishes, their conversation turned to the future and the unique family dynamic we had all created. "I was so scared when the girls first found you," Janet admitted, handing Linda a dish to dry. "I thought you might want to take Madison away from us, or that she might decide she didn't need us anymore now that she had her real mother." Linda shook her head firmly. "You are her real mother, Janet. You're the one who raised her, who bandaged her scraped knees, who helped with homework, who taught her right from wrong. I gave birth to her, but you made her into the incredible woman she became. I could never take that away from you, and I wouldn't want to." Their friendship, built on mutual respect and shared love for Madison, had become one of the most beautiful aspects of our expanded family. As the evening wound down, Madison and I found ourselves on the front porch swing, where she used to sit as a child when she needed to think. The November air was crisp but not cold, and we wrapped ourselves in one of Janet's homemade quilts as we talked about how much our lives had changed since that fateful morning in the coffee shop. "Do you ever regret it?" Madison asked. "Finding Linda, learning the truth about why we were separated? Sometimes I wonder if ignorance was bliss, if not knowing was easier than dealing with all the complicated emotions that came with the truth." I considered her question seriously before answering. "No," I said finally. "Even with all the pain and complexity, I wouldn't change anything. For the first time in my life, I understand where I come from, why I felt incomplete, and what that empty space inside me was always missing. And I have you, my sister, my other half, my best friend." As we all gathered back in the living room for one final cup of coffee before Linda headed home to her apartment, the conversation naturally turned to our plans for Christmas, our first Christmas as a complete family. Robert was already talking about expanding his model train display to include a village that Linda could help design, while Janet was planning a Christmas morning that would accommodate both our new traditions and the old ones that had sustained the Williams family for years. Linda was quietly overwhelmed by being included in long-term family planning, something she'd never experienced as an adult. "You know," she said, looking around at all of us, "I used to think that the worst day of my life was when I had to choose which of my daughters to give away. But now I realize that day wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a different chapter. And this chapter, with all of us together, is more beautiful than anything I ever dared to hope for." What an incredible journey this has been. I want to know, where are you watching from? What did you think of our story of finding family against all odds? Drop a comment below about your own family reunions or stories. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories that prove love and faith can overcome anything. Thank you for being part of our family's journey.